Why did the mountains feel like they were watching her? Every step Julia took sank into the blistering dust of the training field, her boots leaving shallow imprints that vanished almost instantly under the heat. The Caucasus sun blazed like judgment itself, 100 degrees and rising, and the air shimmered with mirage and tension. Around her, recruits were running drills, shouting cadence through gritted teeth, sweat darkening every patch of fabric. But Julia barely heard them. Her pulse was louder. Her breath was sharper. She just had to keep going. The commander's whistle screamed through the air. Drop! The entire row of trainees fell to the ground for push-ups. Hands burning against the sun-heated soil, Julia pushed until her arms trembled. 37, 38. Her body screamed for mercy, but her mind stayed steady. Don't stop. Don't give them a reason to look at you. She had spent weeks learning how to disappear, how to be average enough to blend in, quiet enough to be ignored. It wasn't pride that made her silent. It was survival. Because no one here knew who she really was, not even her closest friend. "Come on, Vyulova," a voice shouted from ahead. "You'll fall behind." That was Svetlana, her roommate, the only one who treated her like a person and not a number. Julia forced a faint smile. "I'm fine. Go." Her voice cracked from exhaustion, but she meant it. She'd rather fall behind than let someone help her. Every drop of sweat was a promise. I'll earn this myself. When the drill finally ended, the recruits staggered back toward the barracks. The mountain wind was hot but carried a strange kind of relief, the smell of dust, steel, and something wild. Julia stripped off her soaked jacket and hung it on the clothesline. It clung to the rope, heavy with sweat. Svetlana groaned beside her. "I'm ready to quit. My legs aren't even legs anymore. They're rubber." Julia smiled faintly. "Then we'll be strong rubber." Her friend laughed, but Julia didn't. She was thinking of her father again, Sergei Vyulov, 69 years old, former commanding general of the operational headquarters, a man whose name made entire bases stand straighter. But Julia never spoke of him. To everyone here, she was just another cadet, a quiet girl from the city who joined the military for a challenge. When anyone asked what her father did, she'd shrug and say, "Civil servant." It wasn't exactly a lie. He was an inspector for the Department of Defense. But she never said the rest, that he was the man who trained half the generals still serving, that his reforms had reshaped their very structure. He was a legend, and she was his shadow. When Julia told him she wanted to enlist, he'd been silent for a long time. "Why?" he finally asked. His tone wasn't cold, just weary. "I want to be strong like you," she said. "Yulenka," he said softly, using the nickname from her childhood. "Strength isn't what you think it is. The military doesn't make you strong, it tests what's already inside you." "I know," she replied. "Then let me see what's inside me." She said it with quiet defiance. He'd smiled, but there had been fear behind his eyes. Now, months later, standing beneath the searing sun, she finally understood his silence. The military didn't test people. It broke them to see who could crawl back. That afternoon, the whistle blew again. "Fall in." The recruits scrambled into formation. At the front of the field, Sergeant Ivan Karpov stood with his hands behind his back. His shadow stretched across the dirt like a dark scar. Everyone knew his reputation: cruel, volatile, a man who found pleasure in breaking recruits just to rebuild them smaller. His voice carried across the yard, gravelly and taunting. "You call this training? You look like civilians on vacation. I've seen grandmothers with more backbone than you lot." A few soldiers chuckled nervously. Julia stayed still. She knew better than to react. Karpov's gaze swept across the line, predatory, searching. "Vyulova." Julia's heart skipped. "Yes, Sergeant." He looked her over slowly from boots to forehead, his smirk widening. "Step forward." She did. The ground under her boots was so hot it burned through the sole, but she didn't flinch. "Your uniform's wet," Karpov said, circling her like a wolf. "You'll catch a cold like that." "It's fine, sir," Julia answered. He smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. "Oh, it's fine, is it? Then let's fix it, take it off, let it dry, then you can put it back on." For a heartbeat, the field went silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. Julia thought she'd misheard. "Sir." Karpov tilted his head. "You deaf recruit, take it off." Her pulse thundered in her ears. "With respect, Sergeant, that's not appropriate." Karpov's face hardened. "Are you refusing a direct order?" "No, sir, I." "Then do it." The tension in the air turned electric. The other recruits shifted uneasily, eyes darting between them. Even the other instructors looked uncertain. This wasn't training anymore. It was something darker. Julia stood still, chest rising and falling. "I can't do that, sir." Karpov's smirk vanished. "Here I'm God, my word is law." He grabbed a rope from the ground. Julia's stomach dropped. Before she could react, he yanked her forward, ripping at her jacket. Buttons snapped. The air filled with nervous laughter, forced, guilty, terrified. "Sergeant," someone said weakly, "that's enough." Karpov's glare shut him up instantly. "Help me tie her up." The man backed away. Nobody else moved. Julia tried to resist, but his grip was iron. Within seconds, the rope tightened around her wrists, pinning them to a post in the middle of the training field. Her jacket was gone. Her undershirt clung to her skin. Sweat and humiliation burned equally. Karpov stepped back, admiring his work. "Hold your head high," he mocked. "Stand with dignity." Her jaw trembled. The laughter from the crowd stung worse than the rope, but she forced her chin up. If this was meant to break her, it wouldn't. She looked straight ahead, eyes steady, as if daring the world to look away first. That's when Karpov frowned. Something about that defiance bothered him. He turned to one of the aides. "Bring me her file." The aide hesitated, then obeyed. The folder came from the small admin tent nearby, a simple manila file with her name in neat letters. Vyulova, Julia S. Karpov flipped through the papers, reading lazily until his eyes caught a line. His smirk returned, meaner this time. "Emergency contact, Sergei Vyulov," he read aloud. "Department of Defense, wait a second." A murmur spread through the recruits. Someone whispered, "General Vyulov, that Vyulov." Karpov looked up, amusement dancing in his eyes. "Well, well, the apple of a very important eye." Julia froze. He laughed. "So that's why you're so brave, huh? Daddy's a general, makes sense." "No," she said quickly. "He doesn't even know I'm here." "Oh, I bet he doesn't. You snuck in here to prove something, didn't you?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Well, now you'll prove how strong you really are when Daddy's not around to save you." He turned to the men. "Keep filming. When's the next time you'll see a general's daughter tied up like this?" Phones came out, screens glowed. Julia's vision blurred. Every breath felt heavier. She wasn't afraid for herself anymore. She was afraid of what this would do to him, to the father who'd spent a lifetime building an unshakable name. "Please," she whispered, "don't involve him." Karpov just laughed. "Oh, I'll involve him. The whole army will know what kind of daughter he raised." A single tear fell, but she didn't look away. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. Far from the field, the sound of rotors echoed faintly in the sky, a helicopter somewhere beyond the ridge. No one noticed it. Not yet. But that sound, it would change everything. For now, though, the only sound was laughter. Cruel, small laughter that filled the training ground like smoke. In the barracks later that night, a young soldier named Alexei sat alone, staring at his phone. The video was there, shaky, grainy, but real. He watched only a second before stopping it. His hands shook. "This isn't right," he muttered. He knew what would happen if he reported it. Retaliation, isolation, but his conscience wouldn't let him rest. Opening the anonymous Department of Defense portal, he uploaded the clip and wrote a short message. "This is not training, this is abuse. The victim cannot speak for herself. I'm reporting this on her behalf." He hesitated only once before pressing send. And somewhere across the world, in a quiet office lit by monitors, a red flag appeared on a screen. Why did the air in Washington feel heavier that morning? Inside the Department of Defense's Cyber Operations Wing, the hum of computers filled the sterile space. The night shift officer rubbed his tired eyes as another report blinked onto his screen: anonymous complaint, urgent human rights violation. Most of these were small things: improper storage, minor harassment, disciplinary appeals. But this one had a video attached. He clicked play. At first the footage was blurry. Then the image steadied: a training yard, glaring sunlight, recruits in formation. A woman tied to a post, stripped down, standing motionless as men laughed around her. The officer's breath caught in his throat. What the hell? He stopped the playback and rewound it, zooming in on the girl's face. Her eyes weren't pleading. They were calm, defiant even. That somehow made it worse. He opened her personnel file to verify the complaint. Name: Vyulova Julia S. Emergency contact, Sergei Vyulov, Inspector General, Department of Defense. The officer froze. The screen's glow reflected in his widening eyes. For a long moment he couldn't move. Then, almost mechanically, he picked up the phone. "Sir, I think you should see this," he said to his supervisor. By morning, the video had passed through 3 departments and landed on the desk of the Deputy Secretary of Defense. He watched it once, expression unreadable, then leaned back and sighed heavily. "Of all people," he muttered, "why her?" He glanced toward the window where the sunlight crept through the blinds. Outside, the city was just waking up. Inside, the machinery of bureaucracy began to hum with quiet panic. At 8:00 a.m., a courier stepped into the office of Sergei Vyulov. The general, still imposing despite his age, was reviewing files for an upcoming military reform meeting. His reading glasses sat low on his nose. He looked up when the courier entered. "Yes. Urgent file, sir, from the Deputy Secretary's office." Vyulov nodded, dismissing him with a polite thank you. He didn't think much of it until he opened the folder. Inside was a tablet. A video paused on its screen. His heart slowed as he recognized the setting: a training yard, a uniform, sunlight, rope. He pressed play. The breath left his body. His hand began to tremble. He leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. For a moment he couldn't even hear the sounds, the shouts, the laughter. He could only see her. His daughter, Julia, standing there bound and humiliated, her face streaked with dirt and sunlight. Her eyes, even in that moment, calm. The tablet slipped from his hand and hit the floor. The sound echoed across the office like a gunshot. "General," his aide called from outside. Vyulov didn't answer. He stared at nothing, breath short, his pulse pounding in his ears. Decades of discipline crumbled in seconds. Every instinct screamed the same word: go. He snatched up the tablet, stormed past the aide, and barked, "Get a chopper ready. We're leaving for the Caucasus now." "Sir, wait," the aide ran after him. "The deputy minister just called. He wants to speak with you immediately." "I don't have time for talk." But before he could reach the exit, the door swung open. A man in his early 50s stepped inside, pressed uniform, calm voice, politician's eyes. "Sergei," he said smoothly, "I just saw the footage. Sit. We need to discuss this." "Discuss?" Vyulov snapped. "My daughter is standing half naked and tied to a post while your men laugh, and you want to discuss." The deputy minister held up a hand. "I understand. Believe me, I do. But if you fly down there in person, it will be seen as interference. It'll look like the Inspector General is abusing power to protect his family." Vyulov's voice cracked with anger. "My family, that's my child." The deputy's expression softened. "Sergei, the moment you act as a father, they'll accuse you of corruption. They'll bury your legacy. The media will twist this into something else. Let us handle it properly, the legal way." Vyulov paced, every step heavy with fury. The legal way, you mean quietly. You'll handle it until everyone forgets. 2 days, the deputy said firmly. Give me 48 hours. We'll launch an internal investigation, suspend the officer, and ensure your daughter's safety. If we move hastily, it will backfire for her most of all. Vyulov stared at him, eyes blazing. The man wasn't wrong, but something deep in his chest, a father's instinct, screamed that waiting would cost more than time. Finally, through clenched teeth, he said, "You have 2 days, not a second more." The deputy nodded in relief. Understood. When Vyulov left, the deputy waited until the door shut, then exhaled and muttered under his breath, "We'll take care of it all right." He picked up the phone. "Contact the Caucasus base. Tell them to erase every copy of that video, quietly. Cover it up." That was the plan. Back in the mountains, the heat was worse than ever. Julia hadn't slept. The barracks felt like a coffin, airless, suffocating. She spent the night sitting on her bunk, staring at the floor, her wrists raw from the rope. The door banged open. Karpov's voice cut through the silence. "Rise and shine, recruits. New day, new fun." The recruits scrambled. Julia stood last, muscles aching. She could feel every stare, pity from some, fear from others. No one spoke. Karpov's boots thudded closer. Vyulova stepped forward. She obeyed. He circled her again, same smirk as yesterday. "You've been busy, haven't you?" She frowned. "Sir. Don't play dumb. Someone ratted us out, sent a video up the chain." He leaned close enough that she could smell the bitterness on his breath. "You think your father won't find out? Oh, he already has. They told me to take it easy on you, to be gentle." He spat the word like poison. She said nothing. "Let me tell you something, sweetheart." His tone dropped to a whisper. "There's no such thing as gentle in my camp. Today, you'll earn that name you're so proud to hide." He threw the rope at her feet. "Kneel." Her heart hammered. "Sir, I." "Kneel." She didn't move. He kicked the back of her legs. Pain shot through her calves. "I said kneel." The world narrowed to heat, dirt, and humiliation. She fell to her knees, head bowed, fists clenched. "That's better," Karpov said with a grin. "That's what the daughter of a general looks like on her knees." The recruit stood frozen. Even the air seemed too ashamed to move. In the command tent, a phone rang. The company commander picked it up, listened for a moment, then looked pale. "Yes, sir, understood." He stepped outside, looked across the field, and then turned away. Whatever the voice on the other end had said, it was clear. Do nothing. By noon, Julia's knees were bleeding. Karpov finally released her, tossing her uniform jacket at her feet. "You'll learn your place eventually." She didn't reply. She just picked up the jacket with shaking hands and walked back toward the barracks. Each step left a faint drop of blood on the dirt. That night, far away in Moscow, Sergei Vyulov sat in his dark living room. He hadn't gone to the office. The city lights outside blurred through the window. In his hand was an old photograph. A little girl wearing an oversized military jacket, saluting her father. His phone buzzed. Unknown number, he answered. "Comrade General." He recognized the voice instantly. Colonel Dmitry Alov, one of his former subordinates, now with the military police. "Dima." "Sir, I heard about what happened." Vyulov's grip tightened. "How?" Rumors spread fast. The video's already circulating on internal channels, but that's not all. There was hesitation in Alov's voice. The deputy minister's trying to suppress it. Orders to the base, destroy all evidence. Vyulov stood abruptly. "What?" "Yes, sir, they're burying it." Silence, then the sound of Vyulov's slow, controlled breathing. "Comrade General," Alov continued quietly, "you once told me that a real soldier protects the weak. Right now, your daughter is the weakest person in that base." The old general stared at the insignia on his uniform, the rows of medals, the symbols of obedience and restraint. all of it suddenly meaningless. Olaf's voice softened. If you act now, they'll call it insubordination. But if you wait, they'll destroy every trace of what happened. I can get you there by dawn, quietly. I've prepared a helicopter unmarked. Vyulov said nothing for a long moment. Then, quietly, he unpinned the golden stars from his shoulders and placed them on the table. The sound they made was small, metallic, final. Tomorrow, he said, voice steady now, I'm not flying there as a general. Olaf hesitated, then as what? As her father. Outside, the first light of dawn began to break across Moscow. Somewhere in the distance, the faint hum of rotor blades stirred the air. And far away in the mountains, Julia Vyulova sat awake again, staring at the same rising sun. Neither of them knew it yet, but by sunset, those mountains would never forget the sound of what came next. The mountain air was thick that morning, the kind that pressed on your lungs, tasted of metal and heat. Even before sunrise, the temperature was rising. The training center felt like a furnace trapped between cliffs. Every sound, every boot step, every shout echoed off the stone walls and came back sharper. Julia Vyulova woke before the alarm. She hadn't really slept. The faint scars from the rope still burned on her wrists, but what ached more was the silence around her. The barracks had become quieter since yesterday, not with rest but fear. The girls who once laughed with her now avoided her gaze. Even Svetlana didn't know what to say anymore. Julia sat on the edge of her bunk, tracing the bruises on her forearms with her thumb. They looked like handprints, reminders of power and helplessness twisted together. She thought of her father again. How many times had she sworn she wouldn't need him, that she would stand on her own? Now she wasn't sure what standing on her own even meant anymore. The door slammed open. "Rise and shine," Sergeant Karpov's voice cut through the air like a blade. "We've got a special morning ahead." Julia's stomach turned. She didn't move. "On your feet, recruits." The others scrambled to obey, boots hitting the floor in uneven rhythm. Julia stood slowly, forcing her shaking legs to hold steady. Karpov's boots thudded closer until he stood right in front of her. He grinned, that same grin she'd come to dread. Well, well, the general's daughter's still here. No one laughed this time. Even the usual snickers had died out. Everyone knew it had gone too far, but no one dared to stop it. Fear had its own chain of command. "Outside," he said simply. The morning light was just beginning to creep over the ridgeline, spilling gold over the parade ground. Dust shimmered in the air like ghosts. Julia followed him out, her bare hands brushing against the coarse fabric of her uniform, still damp from yesterday's sweat. When they reached the field, Karpov turned to the watching recruits. "Everyone gather round. Today's exercise will teach you obedience." He uncoiled a length of rope again. Julia's breath caught. Her body went cold. "Sir, please." Karpov raised an eyebrow. "Please what?" "Don't do this again." He stepped closer until his shadow fell over her face. "You think you're special because of your name. You think you can make rules. Out here, I'm the only rule." His hand shot out, gripping her collar. She didn't flinch, but her pulse thundered in her throat. "Take off the jacket." Her voice barely held. "No, sir." Karpov's grin widened, the grin of a man who'd found another chance to prove his dominance. He turned toward the recruits. "Everyone here's going to witness what happens when arrogance meets command." He jerked the rope from his belt. "Kneel." Julia didn't move. Her vision tunneled. Somewhere deep inside her, something cracked not from fear but from disbelief. Was this really happening again? "I said kneel." She stayed upright, chest heaving. Karpov's patience broke. He kicked the back of her knees. Pain exploded through her legs and she fell to the ground, catching herself on her hands. Dust filled her mouth, dry and bitter. "Kneel properly." She looked up, tears threatening but refusing to fall. "You can break my body, Sergeant," she whispered, "but not my name." For the first time, something flickered in his expression, not guilt, not hesitation, but irritation. He wanted obedience, not defiance. He forced her down until her knees dug into the gravel. That's better. The general's daughter brought back to her place. Silence swallowed the yard, even the wind stilled. The other recruits looked away. Some clenched their fists, others bit their lips. No one moved. Julia's breath came shallow. Her skin burned under the sun. Every second felt like a year. But far from the mountains, another engine was stirring. In Moscow, dawn painted the sky pale orange. The streets were quiet except for the occasional whir of early traffic. At a restricted military helipad near the river, two men stood beside a black helicopter. One was the pilot checking instruments. The other was Sergei Vyulov, standing in his formal jacket but without his stars. His chest looked strangely bare without medals. Colonel Dmitry Alov approached, carrying a small duffel. "All set, sir. Fuel for 4 hours, comms secure. Officially, this aircraft is still under maintenance. No flight logs." Vyulov nodded. His face was calm, but his eyes were a storm. "Once we lift off," Alov continued, "you'll be considered off record if they find out." "They won't," Vyulov interrupted. "And even if they do, I'll face the consequences after she's safe." The pilot glanced back. "We're ready when you are, General." "Not General," Vyulov said quietly, stepping toward the helicopter. "Just Sergei." He climbed in. The blades began to spin, slow at first, then faster, the roar filling the hangar. Dust and papers whipped into the air. As the helicopter lifted, Moscow's skyline fell away beneath them. The silver river, the long boulevards, the city that had built him and now would try to stop him. He didn't look back. The journey was long, 3 hours of silent resolve. The pilot occasionally glanced at him through the mirror, but Vyulov never spoke. He just stared at the horizon, hands clenched on his knees. Every mile felt like shedding a layer of rank, a lifetime of command. He was no longer a general flying to a base. He was a father flying to a daughter. Back at the training center, Karpov's cruelty escalated. The sun had risen high, baking the ground beneath them. Julia had been kneeling for nearly 2 hours. Sweat dripped from her hair onto the dirt. Her mind began to drift, flashes of her father teaching her to ride a bike, his laughter when she fell, the way he always said, "A Vyulov doesn't stay down." "Head up," Karpov barked. She lifted her chin, vision swimming. He smirked. "Good. Now you look like a soldier again. Shame you had to be taught the hard way." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. She didn't have the strength left to argue. "Get her on her feet," he ordered 2 assistants. They hesitated, then helped her up. Her legs wobbled. Blood streaked down her shin from the gravel cuts. Karpov's voice lowered, almost conversational. "You think your father's coming, don't you?" Julia didn't answer. He laughed softly. "He's not. They'll keep him locked in an office while you rot here. That's how the system works. Even generals bow to politics." He turned away. "Tie her again, this time to the lower post." "Sir," one of the men began, uncertain. "Do it." They obeyed. The rope bit into her wrists once more, rough and familiar. She felt numb now, past shame, past fear. From the corner of her eye, she saw Svetlana watching. Their gazes met for a moment. Svetlana's lips trembled, as if she wanted to say something, to scream maybe, but all that came out was a whisper. "I'm sorry." Julia gave a faint nod. Even that hurt. Hours later, the roar of the helicopter began to echo faintly through the mountains. At first, no one paid attention. Training helicopters sometimes passed overhead during drills, but this sound was different, deeper, heavier. It wasn't passing by, it was approaching. The wind shifted, dust began to swirl, the recruits shielded their faces. Karpov squinted up at the sky. What the hell? A black military helicopter was descending fast, kicking up a storm of sand and debris. The sound was deafening, engines howling as it hovered above the field. The recruits stumbled back, shouting over the roar. Even Karpov had to shield his eyes from the whipping wind. "What is this? Who authorized this landing?" he yelled, trying to keep his footing. The helicopter's skids touched the ground. The door slid open. A man stepped out. No insignia, no medals, just a plain military uniform and eyes that had seen too many battles to flinch. For a second, no one spoke. The air seemed to freeze. Karpov's voice broke the silence. "Who are you?" The man walked forward slowly, dust swirling around his boots. Behind him, two military police officers disembarked, scanning the area. The man stopped 10 paces away from Karpov. "Sergei Vyulov," he said simply. Karpov blinked. The name hit him like a bullet. General Vyulov. The older man's expression didn't change. Not today. His gaze moved past Karpov to the post, to the girl bound there, her face pale, her body trembling. For the first time in years, something inside him cracked. His breath hitched and he muttered under his breath, "Yulenka." Julia looked up, barely believing what she saw. "Dad." He didn't answer. He just walked toward her, every step deliberate. The soldiers parted without being told. No one dared move. When he reached her, he untied the rope himself, his hands trembling. Her wrists were raw and red. He placed his jacket over her shoulders, then turned to face the men. "Military police," he said, his voice calm but lethal. "Arrest that man." Karpov stumbled back. "Wait, General, I was just following." "I told you," Vyulov interrupted. "Today I'm not a general." The officers moved in, handcuffing Karpov before he could protest. The recruits watched in stunned silence. Julia leaned against her father, too weak to stand on her own. His hand rested on her shoulder, steady, protective. For a long time, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the still-turning blades. When Vyulov finally did speak, his words carried through the entire field. "Some ranks are worn on the chest," he said, eyes on his daughter. "Others are earned in silence. Today, she's the stronger one." He looked back at the helicopter. "We're going home." Julia nodded faintly, her voice a whisper barely carried by the wind. "I told you I wanted to stand on my own." He smiled through wet eyes. "And you did, Yulenka, you did." The two walked toward the helicopter as the morning sun broke fully over the mountains. Dust rose behind them, swallowing the parade ground in gold. And as the engine roared again, every soldier on that base understood something they couldn't quite explain, that this wasn't just rescue. It was reckoning. The mountains were quiet again. After the roar of the helicopter faded, all that was left was dust, slowly settling over the empty parade ground. The same place that had witnessed humiliation now stood frozen in silence, like the aftermath of a battle no one spoke of. Hours later, the barracks were locked down. Military police combed through rooms, confiscating phones, ordering recruits to write statements. Every soldier who had laughed, recorded, or looked away sat pale-faced at the long tables in the mess hall, scribbling with trembling hands. Fear had replaced bravado. Inside the command tent, Colonel Dmitry Alov oversaw the process with quiet authority. "Names, times, witnesses," he said flatly. "No summaries, no excuses." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His presence carried the weight of consequence. Meanwhile, in the infirmary, Julia sat on the edge of a cot. The antiseptic smell stung her nose. Her wrists were bandaged, her knees bruised, but the physical pain barely registered. What hurt more was the look in her father's eyes when he untied her, the kind of look that broke something sacred between them. He sat across from her now, silent. His uniform was still dust-stained from the field. His rank stars, medals, insignia, all gone. Julia wanted to speak, but her throat tightened. "How do you tell a man who's commanded armies that you feel small, that you didn't want to be saved, but you're grateful anyway?" "You shouldn't have come," she whispered finally. Sergei Vyulov looked up, his gaze heavy but calm. "And you shouldn't have been left alone. I could have handled it." He gave a faint smile, sad, knowing. "There are things you should never have to handle." Silence again. Only the faint hum of the ceiling fan filled the room. Outside the infirmary window, the horizon was bleeding into dusk. The mountains, once fierce and gold, turned blue and distant. Julia watched the light fade. She thought of the recruits, the ones who had laughed, the ones who had looked away, the one who had reported. "Alexa. Did you find him?" she asked quietly. "The one who sent the report." Her father nodded. "He's safe, for now. The ministry will question him, but Colonel Olaf has his back." Julia exhaled softly, relief mixed with guilt. He didn't have to risk himself. "No," Vyulov said, "but he did. That's what makes a soldier. Sometimes courage isn't running into fire, it's standing still when everyone else runs away." Julia looked down at her hands. The bandages were clean, white, too neat for what she felt inside. "I didn't want you to see me like that." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "When you were 6, he said quietly, "you put on my old tunic, remember? It was so big you could barely see your hands." A ghost of a smile flickered across her face. "You told me I'd grow into it someday." "And you did." His voice broke slightly, "just not in the way I imagined." She swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "They're going to say you broke protocol." "They'll be right," he said without hesitation, "and I'd do it again." Julia opened her mouth to argue but stopped. Because for the first time in her life, her father wasn't speaking as a general or as a man of the system. He was speaking as the person she'd always needed him to be, just her father. That realization hurt and healed at the same time. A knock on the door interrupted them. Colonel Olaf stepped in, removing his cap. "Sir, the investigation team from Moscow has arrived. They're asking for you." Vyulov straightened slowly. His movements seemed heavier than before, as though every decision carried a cost. "Tell them I'll be there in 5 minutes." Olaf nodded, then looked at Julia. "You should rest, Lieutenant." Julia gave a tired smile. "You don't have to call me that." Olaf's expression softened. "You earned it." Then he left quietly. When they were alone again, Vyulov stood, adjusting his cuffs, out of habit more than pride. "They'll try to turn this into a scandal," he said. "They'll paint it as insubordination, emotional instability, a personal vendetta." Julia frowned. "Against you." "Against both of us." "Then I'll tell them the truth." "You will," he said firmly, "but be careful what they make of it." He walked toward the door, then paused. "Rest. I'll come back for you soon." When he was gone, Julia lay back on the cot, staring at the ceiling. Her body ached, but her mind wouldn't stop replaying everything, the laughter, the rope, the silence of those who watched. And her father's voice, "There are things you should never have to handle." Outside, the sound of boots echoed across the corridor. The investigation had begun. In the command tent, a group of officials sat around a long table covered in papers, recorders, and untouched coffee cups. The deputy minister himself was on the central monitor, his face rigid with controlled irritation. "Sergei," he began, "your unauthorized flight has created a situation." Vyulov stood at the opposite end of the table, arms folded. "My unauthorized flight stopped a crime in progress." "This could have been handled internally." "It was handled internally," Vyulov said, voice steady. "Internally enough that it nearly destroyed my daughter." The silence that followed was sharp. The deputy minister exhaled. "You know how the system works. You've spent your life in it." "Yes," Vyulov said. "That's why I know when it's rotting." A few officers shifted uncomfortably. The tension in the tent thickened. "Sergei," the deputy minister said carefully, "we can't make this public. The footage has already leaked within the department. If it spreads further, the reputation of the entire armed forces will suffer. We'll lose credibility, morale." "Then maybe," Vyulov interrupted, "we should start earning credibility instead of protecting it." No one spoke after that. The deputy minister's voice grew cold. Officially, you're suspended pending review. Unofficially, go home. Let us fix this. Vyulov's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. I'll go home, he said, but I won't stay silent. When the screen went dark, he turned to Colonel Olaf. They'll bury this if we let them. Olaf nodded grimly. Then we don't let them. Later that night, Vyulov stood outside the infirmary again. Through the glass, he saw Julia asleep, or trying to be. Her chest rose and fell unevenly. He remembered the little girl in the oversized tunic saluting him, her laughter echoing through their old apartment. The sound had always made him proud. Now it haunted him. He whispered softly, almost to himself, I spent my life teaching soldiers how to be strong. I never realized I'd have to teach myself how to be human. He stayed there a long time before walking away. 2 days later, they were flown back to Moscow. The helicopter ride was silent except for the dull thrum of the blades. Julia watched the clouds roll beneath them, her thoughts drifting. When they landed, the city felt colder than she remembered. The gray buildings loomed like sentinels. As they exited the base, photographers' flashes burst from behind the fence, journalists already sniffing the story. Keep your head down, her father murmured. I'm not ashamed, she said quietly. He looked at her, really looked, and for the first time since this began, he smiled. I know. At headquarters, Julia was questioned for 6 straight hours. They asked everything. What happened when it started, why she didn't report it sooner. Their voices were polite, clinical, detached, as if discussing weather, not trauma. Each answer she gave felt like reopening a wound. When it was over, she stepped outside, the evening sky bleeding orange over the city. She found her father waiting in the corridor. How'd it go? He asked. They wanted details, she said, but not truth. He nodded. They rarely do. For a moment they stood in silence. The hallway buzzed faintly with distant conversations. Then Julia said softly, I don't think this will change anything. Vyulov's eyes darkened. It will. Even if it kills my career, it will. You really believe that? I have to, he paused. Otherwise, what was any of it for? She reached out, hesitated, then took his hand not as a soldier, not as a subordinate, but as a daughter. Then we'll do it together. That night in their small apartment, the city lights spilled through the window like broken glass. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The unspoken bond between them had been reforged not by duty, but by shared pain. Outside, the first reports began to spread. Not the official ones, carefully worded and sanitized, but whispers among soldiers. Someone had finally stood up. Someone had been held accountable. The next morning, Julia opened her eyes to the sound of rain against the window. For the first time in months, the air felt clean. She sat up, stretched, and looked at her reflection in the glass. The bruises were fading. The scars remained faint but visible, proof of what she had survived. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Thank you for standing tall when everyone else knelt. Lay. She stared at it for a long time, then smiled faintly. Alex. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. The storm had only just begun. But this time, Julia Vyulova wasn't afraid of it. The first newspaper headline appeared 3 days later. It wasn't on the front page, not yet, just a quiet story buried beneath political updates and foreign news. The headline read, Anonymous report uncovers abuse at remote military training center. Allegations of human rights violations under investigation. The photo below it showed a blurred image of the parade ground, a single figure in the distance, face unrecognizable. But Julia knew it was her. She sat at the kitchen table, holding the paper in trembling hands. The morning sun spilled through the blinds, streaking across her bandaged wrists. Her father sat across from her, coffee untouched, the silence between them heavy. They've started printing it, she said quietly. He didn't look up. I knew they would. Will it ruin you? He finally met her eyes. It might, but truth usually does. She folded the newspaper and placed it aside. They're already calling me, she added. Journalists, activists, even cadets from other units, they all want me to speak. He hesitated. And do you want to? Julia didn't answer immediately. She looked out the window instead. A drizzle had begun, soft against the glass, turning the city gray. When I was tied there, she said slowly, I kept telling myself I'd endure it quietly, that if I survived, I'd stay silent, because speaking out meant making it worse for everyone, for you, for the unit, for the system. Her voice broke just a little, but now silence feels worse. Vyulov leaned back in his chair, the weight of his years suddenly visible. If you speak, Julia, they'll attack you. They'll call you emotional, unstable, unfit for command. You'll stop being a person to them and become a symbol, and symbols get torn apart. I know. Then why do it? She looked down at her hands. The bandages had been removed days ago. The skin beneath was raw but healing. Because I can't let the next girl go through what I did and think no one will come. Her father didn't respond right away. He just watched her, the same girl who used to run to him holding toy soldiers, who'd once cried when she scraped her knee. And now, here she was scraped in a way he couldn't fix. Finally, he said, then if you speak, you don't do it alone. That afternoon, the phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a journalist. It was a call from the department's press service. Lieutenant Vyulova, the woman on the line said politely, the minister is requesting your presence tomorrow morning. They'd like to discuss how to handle media inquiries. Handle, Julia repeated softly, or silence. The woman hesitated. Just attend the meeting, ma'am. When she hung up, Julia turned to her father. They want to contain it. Vyulov nodded grimly. That's what bureaucracies do when truth burns their fingers. The next morning, the Defense Ministry's marble corridors echoed with footsteps and whispers. Julia walked beside her father, her uniform pressed, her posture straight despite the tension in her shoulders. Every few steps, someone turned to look, some with respect, others with judgment. In the conference room, a dozen officials waited. The deputy minister was among them, eyes unreadable. Lieutenant, he began, gesturing for her to sit. We appreciate your cooperation. We understand how distressing this must have been. Julia sat without replying. We've decided, he continued, that the best course of action is to keep this within internal review. The media's involvement could damage national confidence in our training programs. It's vital that we protect the image of the armed forces. Julia tilted her head slightly. Protect the image, not the people. The room went still. The deputy minister cleared his throat. Lieutenant, we're all on the same side here. We understand your feelings, but emotional statements. I wasn't emotional when he tied me up, Julia interrupted quietly. I was silent. That's what you wanted, wasn't it? Silence. Her father's hand tightened on the table, but he said nothing. The deputy minister's expression hardened. Watch your tone, Lieutenant. You're still a member of this institution. And I still believe in it, she said. That's why I'm here. There was something in her voice, not anger, not defiance, but an ache that made the air heavy. Sir, she continued softly, you talk about protecting the military's honor, but what honor is left if it depends on hiding shame? No one spoke. After a long silence, the deputy minister exhaled. You've made your point. We'll review options. Julia stood. Then I'll make mine public. Her father rose with her. You'll regret this, the deputy warned. I already have, Julia said. They left the room without another word. Outside, the sun was blinding. Reporters waited near the gate. As soon as they saw her, microphones and cameras surged forward. Lieutenant Vyulova, did the military cover up your case? Is it true your father intervened illegally? Are you planning legal action? The noise was overwhelming. Julia froze for a moment, then felt her father's steady hand on her shoulder. "Answer one," he said quietly, "just one." She nodded, took a breath, and faced the crowd. "The truth doesn't dishonor soldiers," she said calmly. "Only silence does." And then she walked away. That evening her words were everywhere. News clips, social feeds, talk shows. Some praised her bravery. Others mocked her, calling her ungrateful, attention-seeking, naive. But the one thing no one could do was ignore her. Inside a small cafe near the academy, a group of young recruits huddled around a tablet, watching the replay. One of them whispered, "That's her, the one who stood up to Karpov." Another shook his head. "She stood up to the whole damn system." The next day, Julia was summoned again, this time not to be silenced, but to be offered something unexpected. A new assignment. When she entered the office, a senior officer she didn't know greeted her. "Lieutenant Vyulova, the Defense Ministry has decided you'll assist in developing new human rights and ethics training for recruits." She blinked, unsure she'd heard correctly. "You're giving me a role." He smiled faintly. "Let's say we're turning a problem into a policy." She wanted to be angry at the cynicism, but part of her saw the opportunity. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, headquarters auditorium. You'll be addressing over 5,000 officers." Her heart stopped. "Addressing?" He nodded. "They want you to speak publicly, control the narrative." She left the office in a daze. The idea of standing in front of thousands of officers, men and women who'd lived their entire lives in obedience and silence, terrified her. But fear wasn't new to her anymore. That night she sat by the window again. The city lights shimmered like scattered stars. Her father entered quietly, placing a mug of tea beside her. "You heard?" she asked. He nodded. "I did. I don't know if I can do it." He smiled gently. "Then you must." She looked up. "Why?" "Because when truth is spoken by someone who has suffered for it, people listen, even the ones who pretend not to." She turned back to the window, tracing her finger along the cold glass. "What if they laugh?" "Then let them," he said softly. "Laughter can't erase truth." Morning came quickly. The auditorium was vast, rows upon rows of uniforms, the murmur of whispers echoing under the high ceiling. The air was thick with expectation, skepticism, curiosity. Julia stood backstage, clutching her notes. Her palms were damp, her stomach twisted. For a moment she thought of walking away. But then she saw him, her father, standing quietly in the back row, not in full dress uniform this time, just a man watching his daughter. She took a slow breath. When she stepped to the podium, the hall fell silent. "Good morning," she began softly. Her voice echoed faintly. "I'm Lieutenant Julia Vyulova. I serve where many of you once did, at the beginning of a soldier's road." She paused, her hands steadying on the podium. "A month ago I thought strength meant endurance, that if I stayed quiet, if I didn't break, I was strong. But silence doesn't make us strong. It just makes others think their cruelty works." Every eye was on her now, some skeptical, some softened. "I stood on that field while people laughed," she said, voice trembling but clear. "And I told myself, don't cry, don't speak, don't shame your name, but that shame wasn't mine to carry." A hush settled across the room. Even the officials at the side looked away. "Strength," Julia continued, "isn't obedience, it's conscience. And dignity doesn't shout, it just stands even when everyone else kneels." Somewhere near the back, her father exhaled softly, his eyes shining. Julia took a breath and finished quietly. "We serve this country not to be feared, but to protect. A soldier who humiliates another isn't a leader, he's lost." The hall stayed silent for several seconds. Then, slowly, someone began to clap. Another followed. Then the sound grew until it filled the entire room. Julia stood still, eyes wet, as the applause swelled around her. In that moment, she understood something she never had before. Survival wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning. The applause echoed long after Julia left the stage. It rolled through the corridors of the defense headquarters like distant thunder, soft, disbelieving, and heavy with something no one wanted to name: change. But not everyone was clapping. In offices where decisions were made behind closed doors, men in pressed uniforms and tired eyes sat around long tables, replaying her speech on muted screens. "She's dangerous," one of them said flatly. "She's honest," another replied. "Exactly," the first man snapped. "And honesty is unpredictable." They didn't say it aloud, but every one of them felt the same fear. If one lieutenant could challenge the silence, who else might follow? By the next morning, Julia's name had spread far beyond the walls of the auditorium. Every news channel replayed snippets of her speech. Some headlines called her the brave daughter of the general. Others accused her of defaming the armed forces. On social media, the reactions were just as divided. Some wrote, "She spoke for every woman who's ever been silenced." Others sneered, "She's just using her father's rank to play victim." Julia didn't read the comments. She couldn't. She sat by the window of her small office, the one they'd given her as part of her new training reform position, staring out at the courtyard where young recruits marched in perfect lines. Their synchronized movements should have been comforting. Instead, they felt mechanical, hollow. Her father entered quietly, a folder in hand. He placed it on her desk without a word. "What is it?" she asked. "Official notice," he said. "The military tribunal has charged Karpov with abuse of authority and conduct unbecoming. The trial starts next week." She hesitated. "Will it be fair?" He looked away. "That depends on how much fairness they can afford." Julia sighed. "He deserves punishment, but I don't want vengeance." Her father studied her for a moment. "You still pity him?" She didn't deny it. He didn't start cruel, something made him that way. Vyulov nodded slowly. Power without empathy always does. He turned to leave, but she stopped him. "Dad." He paused. "They're saying you'll be forced to retire." He smiled faintly. "They've been trying to retire me for 10 years. "That's not what I meant." Her voice softened. "I don't want you to lose everything because of me." He turned back to her, his gaze kind but unflinching. "I didn't lose anything, Julia. I found what mattered." Their eyes met, and for a moment the room felt lighter. Two people, bound by something larger than rules. But outside, the world was still roaring. By the end of the week, Julia's image was everywhere, on the evening news, on talk shows, even on posters in university halls. People called her the voice of conscience. Some wanted her to lead a campaign. Others wanted her silenced. In the middle of all the noise, Julia felt herself vanishing. One night she found herself alone in the defense ministry courtyard. It was nearly midnight. Rain had just stopped, and puddles shimmered under the lamplight. She sat on a bench, listening to the quiet hum of the city beyond the gates. She thought about the word symbol. It frightened her. Symbols didn't bleed. Symbols didn't wake up screaming from dreams where rope cut into their wrists. Symbols were clean, tidy, heroic, everything she was. The footsteps behind her startled her. She turned to see Colonel Olaf, the man who'd flown her father to the mountains, approaching with a faint smile. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. "Not much lately." He sat beside her. The silence between them was comfortable, like two soldiers resting after a battle neither could name. "You changed more than you realize," Olaf said after a while. Julia gave a humorless laugh. "Did I? Or did I just make everyone uncomfortable?" "Sometimes that's the same thing." She looked at him. "You think any of this will matter?" He nodded. "Not today, but someday a recruit will walk into training and know that someone once said enough. That's how legacies start." Julia looked down at her reflection in the puddle, her hair tied back, uniform pressed, eyes tired. "I didn't want a legacy," she said. I just wanted to be a soldier." "You still are," Olaf said. "The best kind, one who fights the invisible battles." She didn't reply, but when he left she found herself whispering into the night, "Then why does it still feel like I lost?" A few days later, the tribunal began. The courtroom was stark, white walls, harsh lights, rows of uniforms. Karpov stood in the center, head lowered, his arrogance stripped away. Julia sat in the witness box, hands folded tightly in her lap. Her father sat behind her, silent as stone. The prosecutor spoke first, detailing the charges. Words like abuse, violation, humiliation filled the room, but they sounded sterile, drained of pain. Then they asked Julia to testify. She stood slowly, the sound of her boots on the floor echoing in the chamber. She took her oath, then looked at Karpov. He avoided her eyes. "Tell us what happened," the judge said. She did, not in anger, not in vengeance, but in truth. She described the heat, the dust, the laughter, the silence. And when she finished, she added quietly, "He didn't just tie me to a post. He tied everyone there to fear, to silence. That's what I want undone." The judge nodded, expression unreadable. The hearing continued for hours, but Julia's words lingered like smoke. When the verdict came days later, guilty on multiple counts, she felt no triumph, only a hollow kind of calm. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed again. Reporters shouted questions, but she walked past them without answering. Her father followed, hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You did well," he said softly. "It doesn't feel like victory," she admitted. "It's not supposed to." They walked in silence for a while. The evening was cold. Leaves rustled along the pavement. Finally she said, "What happens now?" Her father smiled faintly. "Now they'll celebrate you in public and sideline you in private." She sighed, "So nothing really changes." He stopped walking and looked at her, really looked. "That's where you're wrong. Change isn't fireworks, Julia. It's erosion. It's slow, relentless. It starts with one crack in the wall." She thought about that long after he said it. Weeks passed. Her face faded from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, new distractions. The world moved on, but within the military, something subtle shifted. Recruits began whispering her name during orientation. Instructors started quoting her words during ethics briefings. And in one training camp far from the city, a female cadet who was being mocked for falling behind heard her name and stood taller. Julia didn't know any of that. She was back at her desk reading reports, trying to build new guidelines for conduct training. It was quiet work, bureaucratic, lonely, but it mattered. Late one evening, she found an envelope slipped under her door. No return address. Inside was a single line written on official stationery. "Respect begins with fear, until someone teaches us otherwise." Below it, unsigned, were two words, "Thank you." She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to cry or smile. That night, she walked home on foot instead of taking the car. The city lights glowed softly through the mist. When she reached the small park near her building, she saw a young woman in uniform sitting alone on a bench, head bowed. Julia hesitated, then walked over. "You okay?" The woman looked up, startled, then recognized her. "You're Lieutenant Vulova." "Just Julia," she said. "Mind if I sit?" The young woman nodded quickly. After a pause, Julia asked, "Rough day?" The woman gave a shaky laugh. "First week at the academy. I thought I was ready. Turns out I'm not." Julia smiled gently. "No one ever is." The recruit looked at her, eyes wide. "I read about you, what you did. Everyone says you were fearless." Julia's smile faded slightly. "No, I was terrified every second." "Then how did you do it?" She looked up at the cloudy sky, exhaling softly. "Because fear doesn't decide who you are. What you do after it does." The recruit nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, ma'am." Julia stood, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. Just remember one thing: dignity doesn't speak. It acts." As she walked away, the recruit called after her, "Lieutenant." Julia turned. "Does it ever stop hurting?" Julia thought for a moment, then smiled sadly. "No, but it starts meaning something." The young woman nodded, wiping her eyes. When Julia reached home, she found her father waiting by the door, 2 mugs of tea already prepared. He didn't say a word. He just handed her one. They sat together in the quiet, the city humming faintly outside. After a while, Julia whispered, "I saw myself today in someone younger, someone scared." Her father nodded. "Then she's lucky she met someone brave." Julia looked at him. "I'm still scared, Dad." He smiled gently. "Good, that means you're still human." They sat there in silence, steam rising from their cups. Outside, the rain began again, soft, persistent, cleansing. For the first time in months, Julia felt at peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because she'd finally stopped running from the part of herself that refused to kneel. The winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the military compound in silence, the kind that muffled everything except the sound of boots and breath. The cold cut deep, but Julia welcomed it. It made people slower, quieter, easier to read. Her office overlooked the parade ground where months ago she'd been humiliated. Now it was empty, the snow untouched. From her window it looked almost peaceful, almost. The reforms she'd proposed were slowly being implemented. Mandatory ethics briefings, psychological screenings for training officers, anonymous reporting channels. On paper, it all looked progressive. But behind closed doors, she could feel the resistance tightening: quiet meetings, postponed approvals, unexplained reassignments. Change, she realized, had enemies with polite smiles. That morning, she was scheduled to present her new policy draft to the Reform Committee, a group handpicked by the ministry. Most of them older men, decorated, controlled. Her father warned her. "They'll pretend to listen," he said over breakfast, his tone weary, "but they've already decided." Julia smiled faintly. "Then I'll make them undecide." He chuckled softly. "You sound like your mother." Julia paused, her spoon midway through stirring her coffee. "You never talk about her." He looked down. She believed in rules until they broke her. The silence that followed said more than any story could. At the meeting, the air was thick with formality. General Morozov, a stoic man with silver hair and expressionless eyes, presided at the head of the table. "Lieutenant Vyulova," he said, gesturing toward the podium, "we've reviewed your proposal. Before we vote, you may summarize your position." Julia stood, calm and steady. She began to speak clearly, methodically, with quiet conviction. She talked about morale, about leadership, about trust being stronger than fear. But as she spoke, she saw it, the small glances exchanged, the polite nods masking disinterest, the subtle smiles that said, "You're young, you'll learn." When she finished, the room was silent. Then General Morozov leaned forward. "Lieutenant," he said gently, "your idealism is admirable, but this institution was built on discipline, not sentiment. Soldiers obey. That's what keeps nations standing." Julia met his gaze. Obedience without conscience is just fear in uniform. A murmur rippled through the room. Morozov smiled faintly, as if indulging a child. "You think you can fix a century of culture with a few PowerPoint slides?" Julia's jaw tightened. "No, but I can start." The smile faded. "Careful, Lieutenant. Ambition can look like insubordination if you're not standing on enough stars." She stared at him, unflinching. "Then maybe the stars are the problem." The tension snapped. A few officers exchanged sharp glances. Someone cleared his throat. Morozov leaned back, voice suddenly cold. "Meeting adjourned. We'll inform you of our decision." She left the room with her head high, but her heart was pounding. Outside, the snow kept falling, endless, indifferent. That night, her father found her still at her desk, reading reports in the dim light. "They're not going to approve it," he said quietly. She didn't look up. "I know. They'll delay, rewrite, water it down until it means nothing." "I know." He hesitated. "Then why keep fighting?" Julia looked up, eyes tired but burning. "Because I don't know how to stop." He studied her for a long time. "You remind me when I still believed the system could be healed." She smiled faintly. "What changed you?" He sighed. "Time, loss, loyalty to ghosts." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that hurts and heals at once. But the next morning, everything shifted. An email landed in her inbox. Subject: urgent reassignment. Effective immediately, Julia Vyulova was being transferred from the ethics division to logistics and supply coordination, a paper position, buried in obscurity. It wasn't punishment on paper, but everyone knew what it was. Exile. When she told her father, he didn't speak for several seconds. Then, softly, he said, "They're protecting themselves. You scared them." Julia tried to smile. "Then maybe I did something right." But that night when she got home, she broke. She sat on the floor, still in her uniform, tears streaming silently down her face. The fight had drained her. Every speech, every meeting, every reminder of the past, it all came crashing down in one unbearable wave. When her father found her there, he didn't speak. He just sat beside her, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stayed. After a while she whispered, "They won." He shook his head. "They stalled." "I'm tired, Dad." He placed a trembling hand on hers. "So rest, but don't surrender." She looked at him, really looked. His hands were thinner, his breathing slower, his eyes, once fierce and commanding, now softer, dimmer. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly. He smiled weakly. "Just old bones, Julia, don't worry about me." But she did. The next week, he collapsed during a meeting at headquarters. A heart attack. The same heart that had carried her out of that camp, that had fought against a machine too big for one man to move, finally faltered. Julia raced to the hospital, still in uniform, boots echoing down sterile hallways. When she reached his room, he was awake but pale, tubes running to his arm, machines beeping softly around him. "You look awful," he whispered with a faint smile. "So do you," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He chuckled weakly, then winced. "They're saying I should retire. I think they finally got their wish." "Don't," she said, her throat tightening. "You're not done yet." He looked at her for a long time, eyes filled with something between pride and sadness. "Neither are you." Tears blurred her vision. "I don't want to lose you too." "You won't," he said softly. "I'm right there in every choice you make, every truth you refuse to bury. That's how we stay alive, Julia, we echo." He reached out, his hand trembling, and she held it tightly. Outside, snow fell against the window, thick, relentless, beautiful. For the next few weeks, Julia split her time between the hospital and her new desk in logistics. The work was dull: shipment requests, inventory audits, fuel allocations. But she did it anyway, quietly, efficiently. Because she understood something her younger self wouldn't have. Rebellion didn't always look like shouting. Sometimes it looked like staying. One evening, as she left the hospital, she saw Colonel Olaf waiting in the hallway. "He asked for you," Olaf said softly. Julia hurried to the room. Her father was awake but weaker. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I heard about your reassignment," he said. She nodded. "Good," he murmured. She frowned. "Good." He smiled faintly. "You'll do more good in the shadows than on stage. The ones who listen quietly are the ones who act." She sat beside him, tears welling again. "I don't want to be quiet." He chuckled, "Then make silence loud." Those were the last words he said that night before drifting back into sleep. The next morning she found a sealed envelope on her father's bedside table, addressed to her. Inside, written in his neat, deliberate handwriting, was a single note. "You taught me what strength really is. Not command, not fear, but grace under humiliation. Whatever they do to you, don't become them. She folded the note carefully and placed it inside her uniform pocket, close to her heart. Days later, when he passed, the military held a formal funeral, crisp salutes, polished boots, speeches about duty and honor. But Julia barely heard any of it. She stood in the front row, still as stone, the folded flag clutched in her hands. When the ceremony ended, reporters waited outside. She ignored them, walking instead toward the quiet cemetery path where the snow melted slower in the shade. She stopped, looked up at the gray sky, and whispered, "You won, Dad, not them." That night she returned to her empty apartment. The silence was unbearable. Every sound, the ticking clock, the hum of the radiator, reminded her of his voice. And then as she sat there, her phone buzzed. A message, unknown number again. "They reassigned you. They think that's the end. It's not. Some of us are ready to listen." No name, no signature. But Julia smiled through her tears, because for the first time since the beginning she realized the echo had begun. Spring arrived quietly that year, late, hesitant, as if afraid to step into what winter had left behind. The snow melted slowly, revealing the gray stone beneath, the pathways lined with pale green shoots forcing their way through the frost. Julia Vuleva walked those paths alone most mornings now. The hospital visits had ended. The ceremonies, the condolences, the formal letters of sympathy, all done. What remained was the stillness afterward, the hollow space that follows when duty no longer calls and grief stops knocking. She still wore her uniform each day, though her rank now meant little. Logistics wasn't a command post. It was a corner of the military few cared to notice, where numbers replaced names and quiet competence went unseen. But Julia didn't mind. Some battles were louder than others. Every morning she sat at her desk before dawn, reviewing reports, signing requisitions, approving shipments. But tucked within those dull lines of ink and supply codes, she began to notice things, small irregularities, missing equipment from certain outposts, suspicious transfers signed under falsified initials. And slowly, quietly, she started fixing them. She would redirect shipments, reassign deliveries, and send anonymous alerts to oversight officers she knew she could trust. Each correction was small, invisible to the top brass, but over time they added up. One night, while filing through stacks of documents, she found herself whispering, "Make silence loud." Her father's words. She smiled faintly. The next day, she received a visit. Colonel Ilov stepped into her small office, carrying a folder. His hair had more gray than before, his eyes a little softer. "Still fighting invisible wars, I see," he said with a grin. She gestured to the piles of paperwork. "You'd be surprised how much damage you can undo with a pen." He chuckled, then handed her the folder. "This came from upstairs. You'll want to read it." She opened it, scanning the pages. It was a new directive, quietly approved and signed by General Morozov himself. Implementation of Vuleva Ethical Code, Pilot Program. Julia blinked. "They used my name." Olaf nodded. "They tried not to, but eventually even they realized it was easier to accept your idea than keep fighting it." She felt her throat tighten. "You're joking." "Not even close," Olaf said. "You did it, Julia. They'll roll it out next quarter. Ethics training. Psychological support officers at every camp. Anonymous hotline, it's happening." She sat back slowly, the words sinking in. "After all this time." He smiled softly. "Change always comes wearing boots of silence." For a long moment she didn't speak. She just looked down at the printed words, her father's fight, her pain, her humiliation, now translated into policy. It wasn't glory, it wasn't fame, but it was real. "Thank you," she whispered. Olaf nodded. "There's more." He reached into his coat and placed a small wooden box on her desk. "From the old man's locker. They asked me to give it to you." Julia hesitated before opening it. Inside was a single medal tarnished, edges worn smooth with time, her father's service cross. Beneath it, folded neatly, was his handwritten note. "You carried the weight I never could, and you lifted it higher than I ever dared." Julia's hands trembled as she traced the ink. For a moment, her composure broke and she pressed the paper to her chest, eyes closed, tears slipping silently down her face. Olaf looked away, giving her the privacy of that grief. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "He always believed the system could be better." Olaf nodded. He didn't just believe it, he raised someone who proved it. Later that evening, Julia visited her father's grave. The air was cool, the last light of dusk painting the sky gold and crimson. She knelt, brushing a few fallen petals from the stone. "I did it," she said quietly. "They'll teach it now everything you fought for." The wind moved through the trees gently, as if answering. "I wish you were here to see it," she whispered. Then she smiled faintly. "But maybe you are." For a long time she sat there, the sun dipping lower behind the hill. The cemetery was quiet, no salutes, no music, no uniforms, just peace. When she rose to leave, she noticed something small pinned to a nearby post, a folded note protected under a clear sleeve. Curious, she stepped closer. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words made her breath catch. "She was the reason I didn't give up. The reason I still wear this uniform with pride." A former cadet. She closed her eyes and smiled. Alexei. As she walked back down the hill, her boots left faint prints in the wet earth. For the first time, each step felt lighter. Months passed. The Vilova Code was officially integrated into training programs nationwide. The reform wasn't perfect, bureaucracy never was, but something had changed. Commanders now watched their words more carefully. Recruits knew they could report without fear. A new generation began to rise, one that understood that strength and cruelty were not the same thing. Julia continued to work quietly, preferring the background. She refused interviews, declined commendations, ignored invitations to speak on television. She had learned that real impact didn't live in applause, it lived in behavior. One afternoon, while reviewing documents, she received a message from a training center in the northern region. A photo. It showed a group of young cadets standing in the snow, saluting beside a small memorial plaque. The caption read, "Dedicated to those who taught us that silence is not strength." Julia stared at it for a long time. Her hand trembled slightly as she saved the image. Outside, the first signs of spring shimmered on the horizon. The sky clear, the air alive with distant echoes of drills, shouts, laughter, not mocking this time but full of life. She walked outside, letting the sun warm her face. For once the base didn't feel cold. Colonel Olaf found her there. "They're holding a ceremony next week," he said. "They want to honor you." She smiled softly. "Tell them I'm busy." "Busy doing what?" She looked toward the distant mountains, the same ones where everything began. "Living." He nodded. "You've earned it." As he walked away, she whispered quietly to herself. So did he. She reached into her pocket and touched the folded note she carried everywhere, her father's last words. The paper was worn now, but the ink still clear. She unfolded it, reading once more. "Whatever they do to you, don't become them." She smiled. "I won't." Then she turned toward the horizon, that endless stretch of sky, that thin line where light met distance. For the first time in a long while, it didn't look like a battlefield. It looked like home. That night as dusk fell, Julia sat by her window, writing in her journal. Not reports, not statements, just thoughts. "I used to think justice was a fight," she wrote. "Now I think it's a seed. It doesn't grow when shouted at, only when nurtured quietly, patiently, by those who refuse to let it die." She paused, her pen hovering. Then she added, My father once told me dignity doesn't speak. It acts. He was right. But maybe sometimes it whispers. And when enough people listen, even the whisper sounds like thunder. She closed the notebook, set it aside, and turned off the lamp. The room sank into soft darkness. Outside, a helicopter passed overhead, black, distant, familiar. Its sound faded slowly into the night sky. Julia looked up through the window, smiled, and whispered, "Good night, Dad." And for a moment, brief, fleeting, she swore she heard his voice in the hum of the rotors. Not commanding, not instructing, just proud. Final moral reflection, narrator tone. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. It doesn't demand to be seen or praised. It simply acts quietly, persistently, until even the silence remembers its name. And when it does, the world changes, not all at once, not loudly, but forever.